Rajiv Malhotra came to Canada chasing a dream of success, while Emily Carter was a young mother fighting to survive. Their lives collided in a secret marriage built on lies, but what began as a deal for survival soon spiraled into betrayal, fraud, and a deadly plot for revenge. In 2016, Rajiv Malhotra stepped off a flight from New Delhi to Toronto with a heavy backpack and even heavier expectations. His family had borrowed money from relatives to pay for his first year of tuition, believing that once he settled in Canada, he would build a stable career and eventually sponsor them. The dream was painted in bright colors: steady income, permanent residency, and the pride of being the son who brought his family into a better future. For Rajiv, however, reality struck almost immediately. The cost of living in Toronto was far higher than he imagined. Tuition bills piled up, his part-time job at a convenience store barely covered rent, and his savings dwindled quickly. He watched other international students struggle in the same way, some dropping out, some returning home in shame, and some finding unconventional paths to stay afloat. At night, he lay awake in his small basement room, thinking of ways to survive in a country that seemed welcoming on the surface but merciless beneath. Rajiv told himself he couldn't return to India as a failure. He had promised his parents more than just a degree. He had promised them a future. This pressure became the seed of a dangerous mindset. Instead of focusing solely on studies, he began listening carefully to whispers in the student community about shortcuts, ways to obtain permanent residency without waiting years or spending endless money. At first, he dismissed them as rumors. But as his debt grew and desperation deepened, those whispers turned into possibilities he could no longer ignore. What began as a hopeful journey of education was already shifting into something darker, setting the stage for choices that would define the rest of his life. Rajiv's turning point came a few months into his stay in Canada, when he learned about a method many struggling students whispered about, but few admitted openly. The idea was simple but dangerous: marry a Canadian citizen, secure permanent residency, and then quietly part ways once the paperwork was approved. What had started as gossip in late-night dorm conversations soon became a real possibility when he met others who had pulled it off. The thought lingered in his mind, offering a solution to every problem: his debts, his legal status, and his mounting sense of failure. Through a friend, Rajiv was introduced to Emily Carter, a young Canadian woman in her mid-20s who was trying to raise her son alone. She worked 2 jobs, lived in a cramped apartment, and carried her own heavy financial burdens. When Rajiv offered her $25,000 in exchange for marrying him, she hesitated only briefly. The promise of money seemed like a lifeline, and she convinced herself it was just a transaction, nothing more. Their wedding was small and staged, carefully designed to fool immigration officials. Photos were taken in a local park, smiles carefully rehearsed, and paperwork filed with meticulous attention to detail. On the outside, they looked like a newlywed couple beginning their life together. On the inside, there was no love, no shared dreams, only a contract built on lies. For Rajiv, the success of the marriage scheme brought both relief and excitement. He felt as though he had found a way to outsmart a system stacked against him. What he didn't realize was that this victory would come at a cost far greater than he ever imagined, binding him to Emily in ways he could not control and planting the first seeds of disaster. Rajiv's initial relief after securing residency through marriage quickly gave way to a hunger for more. The scheme had worked so smoothly that he wondered why he should stop at just one arrangement. He began reaching out to other international students who faced the same pressures he once did: tuition, visa restrictions, and the fear of being forced to return home. To them, Rajiv presented himself as someone with answers. For a price, he promised to connect them with Canadian women willing to marry for money, just as Emily had done for him. At first, Rajiv arranged only a handful of these deals, but the profit was far greater than anything he earned from his part-time job. He demanded large sums from desperate students while paying a fraction of it to the women. Soon, the business grew into a quiet empire, with Rajiv pocketing thousands of dollars. He dressed better, spent freely, and started living a lifestyle that seemed far beyond what his official income could support. Emily noticed the change. She had been promised a steady share of profits in return for risking her future with the fraudulent marriage. But after the first payment, Rajiv stopped giving her anything. She watched him flaunt new clothes, expensive gadgets, and nights out while she struggled to pay rent and raise her son. What had once seemed like an easy deal began to feel like exploitation. The distance between them widened quickly. Rajiv no longer treated her as a partner in crime, but as a liability who asked too many questions. Greed had not only inflated his ambitions, but also poisoned the fragile arrangement. With every dollar he withheld, Emily's resentment deepened, and the fragile balance that had kept their secret safe began to collapse. Emily's unease grew into suspicion the more she observed Rajiv's behavior. At first, she had ignored the inconsistencies, convincing herself that as long as her rent was paid, the details didn't matter. But months passed with no payments, and curiosity pushed her to dig deeper. One evening, while Rajiv was out, she stumbled upon a folder tucked away in his desk. Inside were documents that outlined multiple marriage applications, photographs of different women posing with men she recognized as international students, and financial records showing large transfers to his account. The truth struck her harder than she expected. Rajiv wasn't just a student trying to survive. He was orchestrating a network of fraudulent marriages and making a fortune. The discovery terrified her. She realized she was no longer just part of a single scam. She was tied to an expanding criminal operation. If authorities uncovered it, she would be implicated as well, risking prison and the loss of her child. Anger began to replace fear when she understood that Rajiv had deceived her just as much as he had deceived immigration officials. He had promised her stability, money, and safety, but had left her with nothing except risk. Emily confronted him with threats. If he didn't pay what she believed she was owed, she would report everything to the authorities. She felt cornered, but so did Rajiv. To her, the threats were a desperate attempt to reclaim control of a situation slipping through her fingers. To him, they were proof that she had become dangerous. The more she pressed him, the more convinced he became that Emily was no longer a partner, but an enemy capable of destroying everything he had built. Rajiv's mind shifted from fear to calculation as Emily's threats grew louder. He understood that once someone felt betrayed, money alone might not silence them. If Emily went to the authorities, she would not only destroy his scheme, but also expose the students who had trusted him. That could unravel everything in a matter of weeks. The risk was too great, and Rajiv began convincing himself that the only way forward was to remove the threat completely. He carefully studied Emily's routine, where she worked, where her son stayed during the day, and the times she was most vulnerable. At the same time, he reached out to another student caught in one of his fraudulent marriages, a young man named Arjun who was drowning in debt and terrified of deportation. Rajiv painted Emily as a danger to them both, claiming she was ready to hand over names, details, and documents to immigration officers. He argued that if she acted, they would all lose everything. For Arjun, fear worked better than persuasion. He agreed to help without asking too many questions. Together, they created a plan disguised as an opportunity. Emily was told that Rajiv wanted to meet her in private to settle the financial dispute once and for all. He hinted that he had the money she was demanding and suggested they could put an end to the tension between them. The meeting place was arranged at an isolated farmhouse outside the city, far from curious eyes. Emily, exhausted and desperate for answers, convinced herself that this would finally resolve her problems. She had no idea that by walking into that farmhouse, she was stepping into the center of a deadly trap carefully built to ensure she never spoke again. When Emily failed to return home the night of the meeting, alarm bells rang quickly. She had promised her neighbor she would be back in time to pick up her son from school, but the hours passed without a word. By the following morning, friends began calling her phone, only to hear it go straight to voicemail. Her sudden disappearance was completely out of character, and within 48 hours, the police were alerted. Investigators immediately focused on the last people known to be connected to her. Rajiv's name surfaced almost instantly, given the unusual arrangement of their marriage and the financial disputes Emily had confided about to a close friend. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and though he appeared calm, his answers raised quiet suspicions. He claimed he hadn't seen Emily in days and suggested she might have run off on her own. His composure seemed rehearsed, as if he had anticipated the questions long before they were asked. Behind the scenes, whispers began spreading in the community about Rajiv's marriage dealings. Other students who had once relied on his help now worried they might be dragged into a police investigation. Some spoke anonymously, hinting at the existence of fraudulent weddings and unexplained cash transfers. Meanwhile, search teams scoured areas Emily was known to frequent. Flyers were distributed, and news reports highlighted the disappearance of a young mother whose absence seemed increasingly sinister. For investigators, the lack of physical evidence made progress slow, but one detail stood out. Surveillance footage showed Emily's car leaving the city the night she vanished, with another vehicle trailing closely behind. That second car was registered to Rajiv Malhotra, a coincidence too striking to ignore. The discovery of Rajiv's car on the surveillance tape gave investigators the breakthrough they needed. They began digging deeper into his background, pulling financial records, immigration files, and digital communications. What they uncovered painted a picture of a carefully constructed web of lies. Bank statements showed large cash deposits inconsistent with his part-time job, while emails revealed coded discussions with other students about arranging marriages. To the investigators, this was no longer a missing persons case. It was the unraveling of a much larger criminal scheme. While they pursued the fraud angle, another lead pointed them closer to Emily's fate. Cadaver dogs were brought to search a rural area where Rajiv's phone had pinged the night of her disappearance. Near the edge of a rundown farmhouse, the dogs reacted strongly, signaling possible human remains. Though the ground had been disturbed and the evidence incomplete, it was enough to convince detectives they were closing in on the truth. Rajiv, once confident and composed, began showing cracks under repeated interrogation. Small inconsistencies appeared in his statements, and investigators noticed the way he avoided direct questions about Emily's last known movements. His calm exterior faltered, replaced by nervous gestures and forced explanations. Community rumors grew louder as more people came forward. Former associates described his arrogance and greed, and some even admitted he had threatened them if they failed to cooperate. Each testimony pushed the investigation further toward a grim conclusion. What had begun as whispers of immigration fraud was now tied directly to Emily's disappearance, and the walls around Rajiv's carefully maintained life were collapsing faster than he could rebuild them. The trial that followed revealed the full extent of Rajiv's deception and cruelty. Prosecutors laid out a timeline showing how his desperation for success had evolved into greed and then into violence. Jurors were shown photographs of the staged wedding with Emily, followed by records of the fraudulent marriages he had arranged for others. Witnesses testified about his threats, his manipulation, and the growing fear he inspired within the community. Each new piece of evidence painted him not as a struggling student, but as the architect of a criminal enterprise that left destruction in its wake. Most chilling of all were the details about Emily's final hours. Forensic analysis confirmed she had been lured under the promise of money, only to be met with betrayal. Evidence recovered near the farmhouse linked Rajiv and his accomplice to the site, and though Emily's remains were never fully recovered, enough traces were found to prove she had died there. The prosecution argued that Rajiv's motive was clear. He wanted to silence her before she could expose the entire scheme. The jury's verdict was swift. Rajiv was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, while Arjun, the accomplice, received a lengthy sentence for his role in the crime. Families of the students who had been exploited by Rajiv expressed relief, though the shadow of his actions continued to haunt them. What began as the hopeful journey of a young man chasing a better life ended as a cautionary tale of greed, lies, and deadly revenge. Rajiv's downfall became a stark reminder that shortcuts built on deceit often lead not to success, but to ruin, and in this case, to the irreversible loss of a life.